Following the first few trailers for Dune Part 3, those of us who have read the Dune Messiah book noticed some big changes in director Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of the story. There are changes to the overall timeline, the character of Chani and her relationship to Paul Atreides, and also some added action sequences surrounding both the Holy War period and the events of Dune Messiah itself. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing the main changes that I noticed in the trailers for the film and giving you my theories on how director Denis Villeneuve might be going about certain alterations, like with all the current confusion surrounding Chani. There will be big spoilers from the Dune Messiah book, so if you haven't read Frank Herbert's novel, then I would recommend watching one of my other videos on Dune Part 3 instead. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my content surrounding Dune Part 3, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's discuss some of the main changes coming with Dune Part 3. So speaking at the Dune Part 3 trailer event a couple of weeks back, director Denis Villeneuve explains that the final chapter of his trilogy is going to feel very different from what came before. Instead of treating Part 3 as another massive sci-fi epic in the same style as the first two movies, he said that the new film leans much more into being an action thriller, marking a major tonal shift for the franchise. At the event, he said, "The thing I said to my crew is that I don't want us to walk in our own footsteps. I want us to bring the audience to new parts of Arrakis, something that will be fresh and new, and also for people who know the book, being a very different beast." And I must say, after seeing the most recent trailer for his film, those words by the director definitely ring true, because we clearly get an added sense of scale through some of the additional action set pieces, and then also some big changes that shift the foundation of the Messiah story for this adaptation. Starting with the first big change, and this is one that was revealed to us all the way back with the first trailer for the film, we get a few alterations to the Holy War timeline. Now, previously, I thought that we might be getting an approach from Villeneuve that kind of echoes a Christopher Nolan film, where we have different timelines intersecting throughout the story to tell the full picture of the 17 years between Dune Part 2 and 3, and then also the events of Messiah. But based on what has come out in recent months surrounding the start of the movie, showcasing the Battle of Imphale, the character of Farouk being a highlight in that opening battle, and then also just the general stuff we've been seeing from the Holy War period, I've actually changed my mind on how I think the director is adapting the war and structuring his film. Now yes, he is still changing his adaptation in some sense by adding scenes of the Holy War period to his film, something that was only talked about in the book itself. But I think he's approaching it all in a more straightforward way. Having seen the most recent trailer and the opening prologue scene, I think that this Holy War sequence with Paul, the Fremen, Stilgar and Farouk is actually just the first act of the movie. We essentially get a sense of all the devastation that Paul's Holy War has caused, an introduction to the character of Farouk and how he and Stilgar view things come the end of that war, and then in the moments after this, the revelations surrounding what's been happening with Paul and Chani in the time leading up to the Messiah story. With Farouk and Stilgar, we seem to be getting the moments where they are changed by the presence of water on Imphale, and this of course becomes a central plotline for the Messiah story, in that some of the Fremen who fought under Paul during the war had a psychological and emotional awakening. It essentially feeds into the idea that Paul Atreides' promises of delivering water and victory actually eroded and destroyed the soul of the traditional Fremen culture. And again, while this is exactly how it was described in the book, it's only mentioned in conversations and doesn't actually take place in the present. So the first big change is that Villeneuve is actually depicting the big turning point at the end of the Holy War. My guess would be that this is around a decade or so into that 17-year time gap between the end of Part 2 and the events of Dune Messiah in Part 3. Furthermore, within the first act of the film, I think we're also going to be getting a lot of those scenes that look like they take place right after Dune Part 2 and before the time jump to all the Messiah stuff. We'll essentially get all of the moments between Paul and Chani, filling us in on Chani's pregnancy, the growing tension between them, and then the scene between Paul and his mother on Caladan, which we saw in the first trailer. And yes, in saying that, I actually now think that Chani's pregnancy is a real shot in the newest trailer and not just a vision. I've changed my mind on what Villeneuve is doing with this time period featuring Chani. I'll get a bit more into my thoughts surrounding what they are doing with this at the very end, because there is a lot more to break down. But as we reach the end of Dune Part 3's first act, I think similar to how we got the introduction of Fade Rotha and a time jump in Part 2 about an hour and 10 minutes into that film, I think this is where there will be something similar with the Dune Messiah plotline come the start of the second act of Part 3. And the beginning of that second act would feature the conspirators meeting from the start of the Dune Messiah book, and everything that happens around that point in time with establishing Paul's empire at Arrakis. So to summarise, I think we're going to be getting an opening act that establishes the effects of the Holy War through one of the biggest battles that took place, then revelations surrounding Chani's pregnancy and her destabilising relationship with Paul, and then the start of the Messiah plotline at the beginning of Act 2. Before I get into potential plot changes with Paul and Chani, I wanted to touch on another addition we might see come the Messiah part of the story. As we saw in the trailer, there was an added sense of scale during the footage of Dune Messiah, as following the first looks at Paul's rebuilt Arrakis, we get all the early plotting of Scytale and the conspirators, Scytale sending hate to Paul, and then that massive sandworm set piece towards the very end. Much of the things leading up to that set piece seem to fall in line with what happens in the Dune Messiah plot, but the moments at the very end of the trailer with the sandworm set piece seem to be the main big change from the book. That scene is presumably towards the end of Dune Part 3, as we see that Paul has already been blinded by the Stoneburner. And I think that this whole sandworm sequence is touching on the brief description from the Dune Messiah book itself. In the book, Paul learns that the Spacing Guild plans to steal a sandworm from Arrakis to jumpstart a new spice cycle on another planet. And as I mentioned in my breakdown for the latest trailer, I think that Villeneuve has essentially turned that idea into a full-fledged action scene as a way to infuse the final act of the movie with more urgency and weight. Essentially, it can give the later parts of Dune Part 3 a greater sense of added cinematic scope and scale that wasn't really present in the Messiah book. It also adds another level of threat from those opposing Paul in a way that really speaks to the idea that the future of spice on Arrakis is at stake. Another reason that I think this is the final set piece of the film though, is because of the changes we seem to be getting with the character of Chani. Coming now to those changes, in reflecting on my first act theory from before, all the stuff surrounding Chani's pregnancy, her relationship with Paul, and where that leads us has become quite confusing for us who have read the Dune Messiah book. Right up until this video, my theory was that all the stuff we're seeing with Chani being pregnant, her arguing with Paul, and the shot of her with their children in the binoculars shot is actually due to Paul's visions. But in the last couple of weeks, I've actually completely changed my stance on this. After watching the trailer multiple times, I'm now on board with the idea that Denis Villeneuve has made the biggest change that I didn't expect him to make. I think that during the first act in the many years leading up to Messiah's events, that Paul and Chani do have Leto II and Ganima. So let me break down why I think that. Firstly, I think the shot of Chani pregnant with Paul is a real shot that takes place during that first act and not a vision. And as I touched on before, I think that it's around this time that Paul pushes Chani away. I think that the two of them separate because of the aftermath of the Holy War and Paul becoming that figure who led the Fremen into so much bloodshed. We know that Chani felt negatively towards that happening at the very end of Dune Part 2. But instead of her just leaving there and then, I think that it's actually around this moment in Part 3 where they actually split, bookending the first act of Dune Part 3. This brings things over into Act 2 with the start of the Messiah narrative, and I think this is where things have also been altered. I think that the grainy film shots from the latest trailer are not just visions, and in fact they are memories that Paul is revisiting during the timeline in Dune Messiah. Essentially, it's him revisiting how it all went so wrong between him and Chani. Think of it as a kind of balance to his struggles and prescience in the Messiah book, that he is focused on his memories just as much as trying to see the way forward. He would still be trapped by his prescience like in the book, in having visions of Chani dying. But I think Villeneuve might have added to all of this emotion by having him further yearn to be with Chani again after all those years. Moving on, I think that the binoculars shot of Chani with their children is also a real shot. It could be a case of Paul watching them and wanting to reconnect with Chani, or it could also just be a case of clever editing and a character like Seitel is actually the one watching them. Of course, Chani lets go of her blue scarf in this shot, a symbol of the love she has for Paul. It appears that Paul picks this scarf up in the following shot, but it's not clear whether this is just a case of clever editing to try and make us feel like this is part of the same sequence. But in trying to add all of this up, I think the later shots of Paul and Chani do give us a slightly better idea. In particular, when we see them featured together later on in the most recent trailer, this is during the events of Messiah, and Chani appears slightly different as she calls Paul by his full name. Now, either this is reflective of Chani having separated from Paul, or there's a chance that this could actually be Seitel using Chani's face. I don't think Chani is dead at this point, and to be honest, I think it's kind of up in the air regarding whether this is actually Chani or not. I'm going to stick with the idea that this is currently Seitel. And again, I do think that Leto and Ghanima have been born by this point and aged up slightly, leading into the later parts of Dune Part 3. I'm not sure exactly how old they will be by the end of Part 3, but it would link into why Denis has cast the two actors he has to play these roles. Ultimately, this would all mean fundamentally changing how the ending of Dune Part 3 will play out, even if it does end with the same major beats of the Messiah storyline. I think we get the death of Chani, I think we will still get the death of Seitel using Paul and Leto II, and I think we'll still get Paul walking out into the desert come the very end. The main difference would essentially be how we get there, Chani's separation from Paul for a lot of the story, and then the aging up of their children. Regardless of saying all of this though, I do think that before Chani does die, that she will find some peace with Paul in the story. Whether that's through him trying to reconnect with her, whether that's through her seeing the conspiracy that takes place against him with Seitel, or whether it's how she feels towards him after learning of what happens in the Stoneburner attack. I'm not sure how Denis is going to go about bringing them back together come the very end, but I do think that they will make some peace and reconnect come those ending parts of the film. The only other potential change that I wanted to discuss, and this is something that is more of my own prediction, is what we might be seeing with Alia Atreides. In Dune Messiah, Paul's sister carries the weight of ruling the Imperium as regent, and the story leans into how isolating that role is for her. She's constantly battling the psychological strain of being an abomination, a person born with full ancestral memories, and her strange emotionally tangled dynamic with hate only deepens that sense of vulnerability. All of it leaves her feeling exposed, lonely, and increasingly unstable. Now, I'm not sure what Denis is doing with the whole Alia and Tate plotline yet, because we haven't really seen any of that featured. But when it comes to the stress of Alia's condition, I do think that we are going to see a lot of that in this film, and I wouldn't be surprised if the shot we get in the trailer of her covered in blood and screaming at the Reverend Mother might be linked to all of that stress. I have a suspicion that Denis could be bringing in a bit of her plotline from Children of Dune. In Children of Dune, Alia Atreides has fully fallen under the control of her ancestral memories, specifically with the consciousness of her grandfather, the Baron Harkonnen. Once she can no longer fight his influence, she slips into corruption and decadence, ruling as a tyrant until Paul's children finally overthrow her. So it makes sense to plant the early seeds of that downfall here, with her fractured mind clinging to Duncan for a sense of stability while she struggles against the voices inside of her. And essentially, the Baron's presence would already begin to take root. I think something like this would be a cool way of bringing the trilogy full circle as well, by potentially even bringing back Skarsgård's Baron for a couple of scenes. We haven't seen too much of Alia in all of the footage yet, so it's hard to predict what is actually being changed. But based on some of the other changes being made, I definitely could see Alia's struggles getting expanded upon in some way, shape or form. But that was my video discussing some of the biggest changes from the Dune Part 3 trailers. It's clear that director Denis Villeneuve is expanding upon the Dune Messiah book, aiming to give more depth to the ideas presented in that story, and also making it bigger and more cinematic than it was on the page. Hopefully a lot of the changes work when we come to see the film on the big screen, and if the movie is anything like the most recent trailer, then I think it will deliver. But let me know down below in the comments section what you thought of the trailers for Dune Part 3, alongside what else you think the director will change with his adaptation. For much more videos and breakdowns, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.